Okay, great. So thank you all again for joining us for our second meeting. I think we had a great conversation last time, and I'm really excited about working with all of you through this process. You saw my email update before the meeting, but we really like to dedicate most of tonight's meeting to an equity training, and I'll introduce Dante James, who's here with us tonight just shortly. But I did want to give everybody a chance to just introduce yourselves again really quickly. Try not to spend too much time on that, but we do have some members who weren't able to join us last time, so I want to make sure you get a chance for them to say hi to the group, and then we'll turn the floor over to Dante. And then I just want to save a little bit of time at the end just to go over some of those kickoff events that are coming up, and hopefully land on our a more regular meeting time for us in the future. So didn't really need to share just for that. Oh, I had a few just on Zoom, the Zoom protocol to remind everybody of try to keep your video on if you can, mute if you're not speaking. If you're having an issue, you can reach out to Edson, who's monitoring the chat there. This is a meeting for primarily for steering committee members. So if you're a member of the public, we definitely welcome you here to observe, and you can send us any questions you have in the chat, and we'll try to answer them, or we'll get back to you after the meeting. And just a reminder that it's being recorded. So let me stop sharing, and so we can see everybody here. And again, I'm Liz Weigel, and I'll just go through our team, and I'll call on each of you if you can just give a quick introduction. Maybe Edson next.
Hey everyone, my name is Edson Ibanez. I'm part of the staff here helping Liz on this project, and I'm here to answer any questions you might have as well.
And Ella.
And I'm Ella Stevie, and all those other things apply to me as well.
And then I'm not sure, is Councilwoman Sandoval on the meeting tonight? And give her a chance. I know you sometimes have that, the name pops up.
I am. It's actually me tonight. It's rare, but it's actually me. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Sorry I missed the last meeting. I was out of town with my family and had no cell phone connection. So thank you all for joining us. This is an important planning process over the next 2 years, and I look forward to getting to know those who I don't know. And for those of you who I do know, thank you for joining us. This will set my work caseload for the next couple of years. So this process is super important. So thank you all.
Thank you. And Naomi, did you want to introduce yourself?
Hey everybody, I'm Naomi. I am one of the aides for Councilman Sandoval in Council District 1.
I'm just scrolling here. Is there anybody else from Council District 1? I didn't see anybody.
Yeah, I think that might be it for
okay.
you.
So we'll jump to the committee members. Rebecca?
Rebecca Hunt, Highland resident, and that's as good as it needs to be for now.
Thank you. Mike Falbo?
Hello, I'm having trouble with my video, but I'm going to continue working on it. This is my first time. I missed last week. I apologize, but looking very much forward to it. I was able to watch the videos, and very excited to be part of this committee. I'm a longtime Denver resident, born and raised in North Denver, and then worked for Leprino Foods for the past 30 years. And just recently, my wife bought a property on 29th and about Zunai that she'll be moving her business into. So very excited to be a longtime resident and business owner within the community.
Thanks, Mike, and welcome. Lexi Steinhauer?
Hi, I'm Lexi Steinhauer. I unfortunately missed the meeting last time as well. I live in Highland, and I am I'm on the board of the Bienvenidos Food Bank, which is in Sunnyside at 38th and Pecos. I'm also on the Highland Neighborhood Planning and Community Committee for planning in Highland. So, and yeah, sorry I missed it, but I did catch up as well, and I'm excited to be here.
Thanks, Lexi. Next, I see Lorenzo.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lorenzo Ramirez. I'm a long-term resident of Lower Highlands neighborhood. I also run a nonprofit, cultural arts nonprofit, which is located in the Lower Highlands neighborhood.
Thank you. Trupti?
Hi, guys. This is Trupti Suthar, and I'm with Sunnyside United Neighbors, and I live in Sunnyside. Thank you.
I see Ashton. Welcome, Ashton. We're not hearing you. I'm not muted. That's interesting. Try again. Huh. Is anybody else here now? Okay, maybe we'll come back to you. Sorry about that, Ashton. Ashton's with Jefferson Park, and we'll try to come back to you. Nola?
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Nola Miguel. I live in the Chaffee Park neighborhood, and I'm part of the RNO. My kids go to Academia Sandoval and Skinner, and I work for the GES Coalition and do a lot of equity and affordable housing work. Thanks.
Thanks. Emily?
Hi, everybody. Was this the right Emily? There's
yes, Emily Weiss.
Okay.
Sorry.
My name's Emily. I live in Chaffee Park as well. I'm also on the neighborhood association, the RNO. I do college access work. I don't work in this neighborhood. I work down south, but I have colleagues who work at North, and I'm well connected to their work. So that's a little background.
Thank you. Garrett?
Hi there, I'm Garrett Phillips. Thanks for having me. I'm sorry I missed the first meeting, but I did catch up on the recorded version. So I saw your introductions from last week and looking forward to doing this with everybody. I'm a Denver native. I grew up on the west side of town in West Barnum, but have been in Sunnyside for the last 20 plus years. So I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe that's Ramon.
Yep, Ramon Vargas. Sunnyside resident, grew up in the neighborhood and actually also work in the neighborhood in the Highlands area.
Thank you. Leslie?
Hi, I'm Leslie Twarogowski. I currently serve as the Executive Director of the Federal Boulevard Business Improvement District, and here representing the small businesses of the Federal Boulevard corridor, as well as our neighboring neighborhoods of Jefferson Park and Sloan's Lake.
Thank you. Ben?
Good evening, everybody. My name is Benjamin Chavez. I was born in the west side of Denver, raised in the north side. A longtime north sider, went to Brown, Skinner, and North in my family's own property and had businesses in the north side. I look forward to working with everybody.
Thank you. Nancy?
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Nancy Vallejo, and I am in the Chaffee Park neighborhood. I am also working for DPS at Beach Court Elementary as the RJ coordinator.
Thank you. Esteban? And to your friend?
Hi, I'm Benjamin's dad. I'm a Sunnyside resident, and I teach at the University of Denver. And this guy is going to school next year somewhere. We're trying to figure that out.
Nita?
Good evening, everyone. I'm Nita Gonzalez. I live in Chaffee Park. I've been here 40 years. I'm a Denver native, but one of my friends always says I'm a transplanted East Sider. Grew up in East Denver and then bought our family home here in North Denver. I'm also a trustee for Regis University and involved in a lot of community organizations.
Thank you. Charlie?
Hi there. I'm Charlie Berger. I have a couple of small businesses in the Sunnyside neighborhood in Highlands neighborhood with the Denver Beer Company. Long time, I'm a Denver native, long time Denver family, so excited to be a part of this. Thanks for including me.
Thank you. Just scanning to see if I missed any steering committee members. Shayla? I think she's on her phone, so she might not be able to join right now. Let's see. Okay, we'll give her a chance to join in, and she said she was going to make her way to a computer. Tim?
Hey everybody, lo siento, I'm in the car right now, but mucho gusto a todo. It's great to see everybody again. My name is Tim Hernandez. I'm born and raised out of the north side. I live off 38th and Irving still. Shout out to my aunt. I live in her basement. No, I'm just playing. But I'm also a teacher at North High School, so I get to teach the youth of our barrio on the north side, and I'm really excited for the work that we're going to get to do together.
Great, thank you. And I think I saw Gina join on. If Gina wanted to say hi.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gina Volpe, and I am one of Councilwoman Sandoval's aides. So great to be here. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you. Okay, I think we got through all the steering committee members. I don't know, Ashton, if you wanted to see if your sound's working again.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
It said the host must unmute you. I don't know.
Oh,
Anyway,
okay.
my name is
Sorry
Ashton
about that.
Hopkins. Lived in Jefferson Park for a number of years. I serve on our neighborhood organization, J-Pun over here, and I'm just excited to be part of the group. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so I left you to the end, Dante, on purpose. So Dante's joining us tonight to provide our equity training. He has a long history of working with cities throughout the US, and he's actually worked with us in community planning and development and some of our previous task forces to really help us kind of set that frame about equity, why it's important, what influence it's had in the past, and really hoping to have that conversation early so we all kind of have that picture in mind as we go through this process and talk about how we do engagement, and as we start to get to recommendations, really having that big picture in mind. So welcome, Dante. I'll let you give your introduction as well, and thank you.
Thank you, Liz, and good evening, everyone. I'm truly appreciative and honored to be here sharing in this conversation with so many community leaders whose names I know, a couple of you I know, and certainly know of your work. And so it's just truly heartening to see the level of leadership in this committee trying to do this work for the betterment of your own community. So I truly appreciate that. Again, my name is Dante James. I'm one half of the founders of the Gemini Group, and equity, specifically racial equity, is the work we do around the country with higher ed, K through 12, nonprofits, state and local governments, et cetera. And currently we're based in Littleton. I've been in and out of Denver for a very long time. I appreciate all of you who are natives adopting me. I've been here since 1984 and just doing this work. I worked for Wellington first time when he was the auditor, and then worked for Wellington when he was the mayor. So I've been in and out of Denver politics a good bit, as well as politics around the country. I've worked for 4 different mayors in 3 different cities. So, but it's always with Denver as my home and my base. And, it's interesting. Most recently, I was working for the mayor of Portland, Oregon, running the city's Office of Equity and Human Rights, trying to infuse equity throughout the city government in the city of Portland, Oregon. And interesting that when I first went to Portland, I would use Denver as the model and the example for so many things. And then after 6 years, I came back here and I couldn't use Denver anymore as a model. I was using Portland as a model to talk to Denver. So I just find it really interesting that so much changed so quickly in the city and county of Denver. And so hopefully this type of work will be able to address some of the issues I think that you're all talking about. Most of you in your bios described your concerns about involuntary displacement, the need to maintain the community culture or concern for the loss of community culture where you are, affordable housing, things like that. And so hopefully this conversation this evening will just provide some maybe things to think about, different ways to address issues, perspectives, and being able to ask the right questions. I tell folks most of my job is to ask questions and have people think about them in a different way. And so really that's hopefully where we can get to this evening. I have a PowerPoint, and I'll apologize now because the session we're going to do is usually, at least our version of a foundations and equity session is 4 hours at least. And so I'm going to squeeze a whole bunch of this into 90 minutes. And so there won't be as much engagement as typically there is. We're not going to do small group work and things like that, but we'll still do some engagement because you don't want to sit here and listen to me preach to you for 90 minutes. So it's certainly valuable to hear from your colleagues on this call. The conversation, as you know, is most specifically around race. And when I say race, I mean race and ethnicities of color. And certainly as we're talking about North and Northwest, the demographics you've already seen, and the large Latino population in the areas, that's the culture in the community that's been in existence for so long. And how is that being detrimentally impacted? How can you try to maintain some of that culture? Address the involuntary displacement, which is gentrification. We can call it whatever we want to, but gentrification is forced displacement. And that's really what we're talking about. How do we begin to ask the right questions to address that? And so the conversation this evening, as I said, is most specifically around race and ethnicities of color as it relates to, or in relation to, the dominant culture. And in this country, the dominant culture is straight, white, Christian, able-bodied, and male. And so the real question is, how does that dominant culture paradigm impact and affect everything and everyone not within it? And so this is not a diversity training. This is not that kind of conversation, which typically is, beat up on white guy day. And if you had to do it twice, it's because you got in trouble and said something wrong. Now you have to go back to diversity training. Hopefully this is just professional development as you do what you do. And so any thoughts, questions, burning things you'd like to know before we get started and I share the beginnings of the PowerPoint?
Dante, if I could just interrupt for just a second. Some of the extra names you see on here tonight are from our consultant team that we're just bringing on board. So we'll make sure that we set aside time at our August meeting to do an introduction with them. But just if you're seeing extra people on the call, they're just listening in tonight. So thank you. Sorry for interrupting.
No, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So I'm going to share the screen and we'll just get rolling. And hopefully there will be no technical issues. So here we go. So as it relates to this training or the way that I present it, there's no blame in this conversation. There's no effort to shame or make anybody feel guilty because that doesn't benefit anyone. And so the idea is that it's much different to take responsibility for making things better than to accept responsibility or blame for the way things are. Institutions and systems have been in place long before you ever got here. And so how do we accept responsibility for improving those systems and institutions without accepting any sense of guilt because of the way they are? And so what we're going to try to do this evening is just briefly learn some of the root causes of racial inequities and government's complicity in its creation and maintenance. How do we identify and apply strategies to reduce or eliminate some of the disparities that we find across all identities? Because intersectionality is real. We all carry more than one identity. And this conversation tonight is most specifically around race and ethnicities of color, but we don't necessarily stop there because the identities that we all carry can be detrimentally impacted in any number of ways. And then we'll do some brief conversations around bias, most specifically around institutional bias, because institutions have bias. We all individually have bias, you just can't help it. But also, what are the institutional biases that may be existing in creating or maintaining some of the detrimental outcomes that we see? And so I just also want to make this very clear, that at least in how I have this conversation, racial equity is not a partisan issue. because ensuring that we are trying to achieve the best outcomes for all of the residents who we are serving shouldn't be political. It might have been hijacked to be so, but it's not. Certainly as I presented, this conversation is about improving outcomes and ensuring best outcomes for everyone. And so there's no politics in this for me. So the conversation is most specifically around institutional and systemic bias, institutional and systemic racism. And there's lots of different understandings of what all that means. And so there's a brief video that we always show that describes and explains and gives examples much better and in greater depth than I can. So we're just going to watch this, then we'll have a conversation.
Moving the race conversation forward. You've probably noticed that when our news media talks about race, when they talk about racism, when they talk about racial justice issues, they quite often talk about it all wrong. But have you ever tried to quantify exactly how and why the media gets it wrong about race and what we can do to fix it? Well, there's a new paper published by Race Forward entitled Moving the Race Conversation Forward that sets out to do just that by compiling nearly 1,200 articles from major newspapers and cable news outlets and systematically breaking down the most common mistakes we fall into when we talk about race. And in their research, Race Forward identified 7 harmful practices, the 7 most common bad habits in media coverage of race, as well as recommended strategies to get us back on track. And I recommend reading all 7 for yourself, but right now I want to focus on just one of the biggest traps that racial justice conversations fall into, which is our tendency to focus too much on individuals instead of systems. Because when we talk about race, when we talk about racism, when we talk about racial justice, it's important to remember that there are levels to this thing. There are at least 4 different levels of racism that each need to be considered. The first level is internalized racism, which is all the prejudice, bias, and blind spots you might have within yourself as an individual. The next level after that is interpersonal racism, which is what happens when we act out that internalized racism on each other. Those 2 levels, the internalized and the interpersonal, are the 2 individual levels of racism. And those are the simplest ones to focus on, the easiest to recognize in our day-to-day lives, the ones we spend most of our time talking about, but I'm here to tell you, there's something else. Systemic racism. Once you get past those individual levels, first of all, you have to deal with institutional racism. The racist policies and discriminatory practices in schools and workplaces and government agencies that routinely produce unjust outcomes for people of color. And when you step beyond that level, you have structural racism, the unjust, racist patterns and practices that play out across the institutions that make up our society. The individual and systemic levels of racism are both important, both necessary to reckon with, and they're both usually interrelated. But if you want a real, fully clear-sighted conversation on racial justice, you have to be talking about both levels. And one of the most common ways we fail to see the big picture on race is by failing to think about systemic racism, by failing to be systemically aware. In their research, Race Forward found that our media coverage far too often falls into that trap. They found that approximately 2/3 of race-focused media coverage fails to consider how systemic racism factors into the story. 2/3 of their coverage of race fails to be systemically aware. And that is a problem. When we constantly focus only on individual stories, it distorts our sense of how racism works. It encourages us to see racism only as the product of overt, intentional racist acts by individuals that can be fixed simply by shaming and correcting those individual defects. And it encourages us to see individual stories of transcending racism as proof that there is no more racism. That if we have a black president and Oprah is a billionaire, then there must not be anything else to talk about. And any problems that other people of color still face must be due to deficiencies on their part. It must be a problem with them instead of a problem with the system. And that is no, just no. We cannot have a real thorough conversation about incarceration rates for people of color color, about the thousands of families torn apart by our immigration policies, about the perennial disparities in education, housing, healthcare, employment opportunities. We cannot have real talk about any of the biggest issues that affect us all as individuals if we are not also thinking about the systems involved. We cannot have a discourse that brings us closer to racial justice without being systemically aware. So next time you listen to the news or read the news or watch the news or surf the news, you should take a minute to ask yourself, is this coverage systemically aware?
So I want to take a moment just to invite you to offer any examples you might be able to think of where in the past several years, there's been a focus on the individual actors in a situation as opposed to looking at the institution or the systems involved. I mean, right now you are addressing the institution of Denver city government, right? So how do you see just the media having played out in recent past, focus on those individuals versus on systemic or institutional issues?
One that comes to mind for me is a college aptitude test or entrance exams.
Can you explain a little more?
Well, just maybe some of the criteria, the questions on the exams might not be the same experience or the associations to derive an answer. Just aren't connections that maybe some children in different school communities might not be exposed to.
No, it's great example. Thank you. And I think it's been made clear over and over again that those types of exams are culturally biased for a number of reasons. And so as opposed to looking at the individual student who doesn't know what the hell a regatta is because I live in a 10-block area and that's all I know. How do we make these kinds of conversations about the cultural relevancy of the questions that we're asking so folks can make the best answers possible? Yeah.
One that I have seen that is of concern is how the city deals with our homeless population and the homeless camps. That when we have coverage of it, there's not a real context of race and ethnicity in the homeless community. And certainly it tends to be biased on almost a class line. Well, okay, yeah, they're poor people. Let's not look at what might else be going on.
The underlying systemic reasons why folks are homeless in the first place quite often is never part of the conversation. Thank you.
Can I make a comment? This is Leslie Twarogowski.
Yeah.
I want to acknowledge how significantly the last Blueprint Denver impacted our neighborhood in a racial way. This neighborhood where we are used to be very heavily Hispanic, Latino, Italian American, and racially it's changed very significantly over the last several years. And I want to acknowledge the role of a zoning plan and a neighborhood plan like this one that we're working on now in its effect on racial makeup and racial impact here in the city of Denver.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It absolutely is impactful because it's a strategic plan for the city's growth for the next 20, 25 years and what it wants to look like. And so how do we make sure that it is created in a way that involves and considers the historical perspectives of the area and the people who live there currently, as well as those who've been forced away. and why. And so no, absolutely. This type of process is just so hugely important to the fabric of a neighborhood.
I would like to say, and thank you for that, Leslie, because that's what I was going to say, but thank you for that. But I want to take it a little further. We don't even, as a city ever, we're just starting to now recognize that there were people here long before there was a city, that this was their homeland, who are not, or people act like they've disappeared or they're vanishing or they don't exist. And that impacts what a city looks like and how it honors its history and its past. How did it come about? It really came about through the work. While the history of Denver is not a pretty history, given the Ku Klux Klan and the powers that be, and the relocation of indigenous Cheyenne and Arapaho, a massacre at Sand Creek. I mean, it took forever for people to even begin to recognize or talk about that. Not to even, we can even go into, in lower North Denver, most people don't know there was a really strong Chinese and Japanese community. But where are they now? Where do you see that they contributed? Where is their presence? Nowhere. We don't find it anywhere.
No, thank you for that.
Can I ask Nita for a clarification? So are you saying that one of the systemic issues is that we're not learning from our history and that we need to take that history into account as we are planning for the future?
Exactly. Thank you, Rebecca, for the clarification.
There's a professor, Dr. Michael Eric Dyson, who I believe is still at Princeton, who describes this as living in the United States of amnesia, because we just keep forgetting our history and repeating the bad parts of it because we don't learn from it. And so, to Nita's point, our history is rarely taught in a complete way with context to the facts that get presented. And so it's a great segue to my next segment, which is a brief slideshow of some of the legal and legislative decisions in this country that have been based purely on race and ethnicity. And we had this put together as our answer to the question, why do we need to focus on race? Because, you know, let's focus on poverty, because if we fix poverty, we'll fix everything. Or let's focus on LGBTQ, because there are places you still can be fired for being gay. Or let's focus on gender, because we know women don't make what men make, et cetera. And all of those things are absolutely, absolutely important. But it's my position that there's been nothing as impactful in this country, nor continues to be, as is race. Gender is probably a close second. And so what I'm gonna show you next is that slideshow I just described as the answer to the question, why do we need to focus on race? And so there is no sound to this. So we're just gonna watch this and then have a conversation. So we put this in here to demonstrate this was just not some Southern issue. Oregon was the only state admitted to the Union with an exclusion clause in its constitution that said Black people cannot live in the state, nor move into the state. There were already Black folks living there, so it couldn't kick them out. So it then passed what it called the Lash Law, which just said you can live here, we'll just whip you twice a year until you decide to leave. It wasn't removed from Oregon's constitution, nor technically legal for Black folks to move into the state until 1926. And if you don't know what a mulatto is someone who's half black, half white. And I'm sure you know that this is not a true statement. The 13th Amendment did not abolish slavery. If you read the amendment, second half of the phrasing provides for an exception, which says you can still be a slave as punishment for a crime, or if you're under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. You might not be able to read what's under the editorial cartoon, but it says this is the Americanese wall, as Congressman at the time Burnett would build it. So we've been talking about building walls for a very long time. and I'm sure you can't read the actual article, but the article is about a white woman who was trying to get herself declared to be an octoroon, which is 1/8 Black, so that she could marry the Black man who she loved. And what you can't see in that is that the judge in this case was two-time mayor of Denver and KKK member, Ben Stapleton, and he ruled against her. So we have been talking about race in this country for a very long time, since before it was a country. Racism was built into the fabric of this country, brick by brick, law by law, legislation by legislation. And if it's going to be undone, it needs to be undone in the exact same targeted, focused way, which is why you're here, to put an equity lens on the work that the city is doing with this planning process. And so it's not a new conversation. It's not something somebody dreamed up out of planning and thought it would be good to have a committee of community folks to talk about this. Government has been complicit and explicit ever since there was a government in maintaining or creating segregation and racism by law, by policy. And that's a piece of what you saw. This does not include any of the social racial terrorism that existed all around this country. We can talk about Indian boarding schools. We can talk about all number of things. So this is why there needs to be a conversation on race, because all of what still exists, the ghosts of what you saw still exist in those policies and practices and procedures of today, whether they are specifically racial or not, which most will not be. They're racially neutral on their face. But what is the impact to specific populations or communities? This is the question that you get to delve into as you evaluate what it is that you're doing or what the city is doing in the language the city is using. So now we typically go in a small group and give you an opportunity. So we're just going to do this in a large group. And I'll just ask you this question. What was new, surprising, or impactful to you about what you just saw? What was new, surprising, or impactful about what you just saw?
Mr. James,
Mr. James?
Yes.
Yep.
I'm just going to jump in real quick. So a couple of things. Thank you first for that. Actually, much of it I knew, taught by my father, Corky Gonzalez. We were taught that at home, not in schools.
Right.
But I also wanted to say there's a couple of dates we ought to put in there. 1848, this was Mexico.
Right.
1848, there was an illegal war, this country against Mexico, and we were granted, as Mexicanos, we were granted supposedly first-class citizenship. We never received. So I think it's important to also know that things happened in war, and this homeland is our home. We've been here generations on one side and Indian on the other, many generations, because we're mestizo, mixed bloods. Very much like you said, mulatto. I guess the thing that's important to me is that we do thank you for the history, because I don't think we remember it. And people live in the now, and they think these things that are happening now that are not okay, are not go against our values or principles, actually have been historically going on a very long time. And it took people like this group to think differently, to make those changes. So I thank you for that. Just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Sharon. Ben?
Yeah. So first of all, Mr. James, like I do not know who you are, but I want to thank you very much. And the reason why is to bringing all of this generational trauma that is in this country to the forefront of this conversation and setting that in the foreground of the work that we're about to go ahead and do. Because what I've just witnessed and watched here is one of the most, I want to say one of the most amazing representations that I've seen thus far in a conversation like this. So when we start talking about all of these different things, just folks are saying Highlands, I say Northside, because that's who I am, where I'm from, and who, that is what is familiar to my people. But I know that there are folks that were before me that, that acknowledge this land differently. But being a man of color, Chicano, identifying as Chicano, and of indigenous descent, you know what I mean? We're about to embark on a conversation that's going to be uncomfortable for some folks. And I just wanted to applaud you really quick, because to do the work that we are about to do, we need to put this in the beginning of the conversation. So thank you very much.
I just want to thank you for that information. It's amazing, because I'm working from home now, but I'm affiliated with the Anschutz Medical Campus. I do community-based participatory research, and we work primarily as in communities of color. We're going through exactly the same kind of education right now with all the liaisons. We're statewide. We work in various communities around research. And ours was a little bit more extensive. It was like four 3-hour sessions, but it was really to provide a good foundation to have a conversation. So this is very, very helpful. We're doing exactly the same thing on campus with not only with liaisons, but with university staff who wanted to be a part of this and need to be a part of this. The docs who are up in a higher level than those of us that work in community, but also get it or want to get it. So I think this is very important, and it provides a wonderful foundation for us moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Trixie. Thank you very much, and appreciate the comments from some of the other folks. I think you originally asked kind of what stuck out, what was new. Most of it wasn't new. There might have been 1 or 2 things that came up that I wasn't aware of the date or a specific history. But in something that did stick out was, with the Japanese and reparations there. And my thought there was, even when there is an acknowledgement that something was wrong and that reparations were made, that's really not enough. You cannot go back and make up for the loss over that time. There's just no way. And even now, I think, we're talking about how to make sure, well, I don't know that we can undo some of the loss either. And so I'm curious about how we can undo some of the things that are lost. I don't know that this group or any group, even a law being passed like they did for the Japanese, is going to undo the harm that's already been caused. And while I appreciate this conversation, 90 minutes is simply not enough. Neither is 3-4 hour sessions. And, the conversation is starting, but it'll be over before we even get to any deep level of understanding. But I appreciate that the city took the time to put this together and saying that the equity lens is important enough and that they want us to think about it and consider it moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hey there, this is Ashton. I'll just echo what others have said, Mr. James, and say this is a terrific presentation so far. Something that's stuck out to me, while much of that history that you reviewed was familiar, I think it's important to acknowledge that even early on, like even 19th century, there were times where there was a little bit of progress perhaps made and a little bit of deconstruction, as you described it, in terms of racism, like when Native Americans were granted citizenship at one point. There were small little pieces of progress over time. And then it seemed like, after World War II, and especially in the 1960s, suddenly there was even more progress that perhaps outweighed other things. But then more recently, some of the dates in rather recent history doesn't reflect that. And I think that's important to acknowledge, that even in very recent times that we can easily remember, we're not making progress.
No, thank you. It's depending upon who you want to talk to. Is it one step forward and 2 steps back, or 2 steps forward and 1 step back? Either way, we're stepping back in so many ways. But no, thank you. And I would also suggest a couple of things. One, it's not just a history lesson. As I think several of you said, you're surprised by the currentness of some of those dates. It's not just a history lesson, because people know their history. Certainly Latinos, Chicanos know their history. Indigenous folks know their history. Japanese know their history. Black folks know their history. People know their history. I mean, I've spoken with folks who were in Indian boarding schools, and they have a hard time trusting public education, right? I know families who have Japanese family members who were incarcerated in the concentration camps. I'm guessing folks on this call could tell you being suspended or expelled for speaking Spanish in school. Right, my Black father died before he could legally take his white wife to Arkansas to visit his family. So this is not a history lesson. This is real and personal and still present for so many folks. And it impacts on such a visceral level that it's not just an intellectual exercise. It's just a real conversation about the impacts to people and communities. And that's the real message, I think, is it's not just a history lesson. It's going on today. I mean, look at all the issues around voting rights. After the 2013 decision by the Supreme Court, literally the next day, you saw gerrymandering, you saw voter ID laws and registration and all those things. And no matter what you think about any of those, it has provided for the explosion of all that you see across the country that are impacting voter ability to register. So it's not just a history lesson, it impacts right this very moment. I'm going to post, I just put a link in. No, I didn't. I sent it. Hold on. I have to send it to everyone.
Nola, were you trying to jump in? Sorry for interrupting. Nola had her hand up and I know she was trying to jump in.
Please.
That's okay. I can wait.
No, okay. I posted a link. It's a 34-minute video by a woman named Jacqueline Badalora, who's a law professor, PhD, and she spends 34 minutes describing and explaining where the concept of whiteness first came from in this country in the mid-1600s. I'm guessing you all know that there is no scientific basis for race. It's a political and legal and social construct. There's no science behind it. And so she spends 34 minutes walking you through where it came from and the impacts of it and how race was used, whiteness was used as a weapon and a wedge to drive between different folks. And so if you can spend 34 minutes watching a boring law professor explain it to you, it is well worth your time and it's very informative. I'm sorry, Nola.
I actually had wanted to respond to Trupti's comment and really about what we can do. And I think what we're doing right now, anything that, in order to repair the role that government has had, government needs to intentionally be actively doing reparations and healing. And I think that this process should be all about that. All public funds that are invested in communities should all be about that. And I think we have to get a lot deeper into that, into what reparations actually look like, and into talking, in particular to impacted community members about what that looks like. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. And reparations is not a new concept. Reparations were provided to slave owners for the loss of their property after emancipation. Certain tribes and nations were provided reparations in the context of healthcare that they receive in perpetuity, but also understanding with dollars spent in native healthcare, it would require doubling the amount of money that the federal government spends for native healthcare just to achieve the level of healthcare that federal prisoners receive in prison. So just because they say we're doing it doesn't mean it's being done to any real level. And to the Japanese families, they each received $20,000. If they had a family member who was incarcerated, they received $20,000. To Tripti's point, doesn't cover much of anything. Okay, Leslie? Okay, so in the interest of time and me speaking too slowly, I'm going to share the screen again, and we're just going to keep right on going. And there's a few things I just might have to skip as we move through this, so I can make sure to get you to the stuff I think would be really helpful. There we go, did that. So just what is equity? There's all kinds of definitions. I'm sure you've already talked about a definition of equity, and simply this is our definition, that equity is achieved when one's identity cannot predict the outcome. And if you notice, this definition is not about opportunity, it's not about access, because you can give me access to your institution all day, but if it is still biased internally, my outcome may never change. And so for us, it's about looking at the outcomes and seeing what those impacts are, because it's not about intentions. And so if the box represents those resources that the city provides, in this case, and the fence are the barriers to achieving the successful outcomes of whatever it is that you're trying to do, and that fence is a barrier. How do you remove that fence? How do you shrink it? How do you make it see-through? But if it's a law or regulation you have to adhere to tomorrow, you're not going to remove it. And so what do you have to do? What resources can you provide or reallocate? Because I'm guessing planning doesn't have an unlimited budget. And so how do you reallocate the resources that exist, be it time, be it dollars, be it a satellite office on the west side so that people can go there on a Friday evening at 7 o'clock? What do those resource allocations look like so that everyone can receive the best services possible? So, just another version as it relates to ability. You can give everybody the same bike, but doesn't mean everybody gets to ride it. And so how do you provide what everyone needs in the best way they need it is the real question. And so that's equity, our definition of equity, to ensure that somebody's identity can't predict the outcome, be it in who's living here, what services somebody is receiving, where dollars are being spent in a community, what can predict the outcome, and hopefully it's not race or ethnicity. Now a little bias, a little awareness test. So you get to practice your counting.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13.
Everybody get it?
But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Go!
So it's easy to miss what you're not looking for. And so in this context, we're looking for bias, what may be in a plan, the language, the verbiage, the way it's written, whatever that might be detrimentally impacting a population of folks. But if we're not looking, we'll never find it. And that's really what this is all about. It's about that bias, that institutional bias, that this is the way we've always done it, so it must work. Well, that's not the case at all. And so how are we really asking these questions to ensure that we're getting the best that we can in terms of outcomes? And so back to the screen real quick. Where'd I go? I'm going to skip a couple of these slides, but just the definition of bias. One, everyone has it. If you raise your hand, if I say who has no bias, then you don't know yourself. We all have bias from the time we're born, to the music our parents listened to when we were 1, to the cartoons we watched, to the books, the children's books that were read to us that had no people of color in them, to whatever it is that those conversations and the relationships and interactions we have infuse our biases in them, in us, and continue to maintain them and continue to propagate them on some level. And the hard thing to understand is that our biases don't necessarily align with who we say we are. That cognitive dissonance, that I'm not that, but my actions when I don't want to sit next to that person on the bus, I don't want to do this, I don't want those people in my neighborhood because it's going to bring my property, whatever that might be, right? That's not who I say I am, but my actions are often not in alignment with that. And that's the hard part for people to really understand and talk about. So there's 2 brains working, unconscious and conscious. The unconscious is collecting 11 million bits of information per second. It's moving that fast. So that the conscious brain can focus on those 40 bits of information that require our deliberate concentration, that conscious focus and effort, while the other stuff is happening in the background, which means that the majority of what we do and the decisions we make are governed by that unconscious mind. So just briefly, there's hundreds of different types of biases. There's a few that we'll just talk about real quickly. Affinity bias, people who are like us, or we think we have an affinity with because they're from our hometown, or they look like my cousin, or I like the way they talk, or whatever that might be, is that affinity. And so the real question is, how does our assumed affinity detrimentally impact others who we don't have that affinity with? And so, recruitment hiring is an easy example. But, who gets the benefit of the doubt? This is the real question. Because the folks we have an affinity with, they're going to get our benefit of the doubt. Confirmation bias simply is that it's not normal to seek out information that goes against what we believe. So if we're really working on ourselves and our work, we have to be willing to hear, search out information that doesn't necessarily coincide with what we believe. And we often seek out that information that confirms what we expect to see, what we expect to hear, things like that. And so we have to be conscious of these biases and how they might be impacting our decision-making. There's nothing wrong with having a bias, but does it detrimentally impact folks that we're not aware of by our actions, by our assumptions, and those biases that exist? So I already talked about where we get them. So a couple examples of the world we walk around in that demonstrate that bias exists to support our assumptions and our own stereotypes, right? Nivea's done some outrageous stuff. The message on the left is pretty clear. Message on the right, maybe not so much. But until you cut off your afro and your goatee, put on a white shirt, a V-neck, maybe some wingtips, you're uncivilized. And what that has to do with skin cream, I can't really help you. Fox News versus Fox News Latino. The top story of Fox News Latino is a story about scholarship money for an undocumented student, while the bottom story, Fox News US, is about money for illegals. Same story, same picture. What biases are we supporting? Probably one of the more famous ones after Katrina. 2 groups of folks doing the exact same thing, but the top story is about, it says a young man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store. And the young white couple at the bottom are residents who are wading through chest-deep floodwater after finding bread and soda from the local grocery store. So if you're Black, you're looting and probably a thug, but if you're white doing the exact same thing, you're just surviving. So what is the narrative, the confirmation bias that is happening as we're just reading different stories? So this is a 26-second video clip from a Washington, D.C. morning show in 2016. So we're going to watch this and we'll have a conversation.
But interestingly enough, studies show that if you have between 104 degree or 108 degree nasal tip rotation, those are the ones that are considered the most beautiful, and hers is 108. 106.
to measure our native tip rotation.
And then we know if we have the most beautiful houses.
But symmetry is what they say is a lot in the eye of beauty, right?
Okay, the second most requested eyelids.
So as egregiously amusing as that may be, I would suggest there's a whole bunch wrong with it. And that it has very little to do with bias. Certainly the camera person knew it was a messed up story because they knew who to pan to get a reaction. Nobody asked either the black man or the black woman to present this story. I would suggest this has very little to do with bias and is an example of white supremacy. And by that, I mean just this. White supremacy has nothing to do with violence. A white supremacist is one who believes in the violent maintenance of white supremacy and is running over people in Charlottesville and slicing necks on trains in Portland, Oregon, and carrying torches around and everything else that you've seen. But white supremacy is simply whiteness as the default for all things normal, intelligent, beautiful, professional, etc. So when literally 3 months ago, Band-Aid figured out it needed to rethink its flesh-colored Band-Aids because they look nothing like me, that's an example of whiteness as the default, right? I'm guessing most of the women on the call can think about the flesh-colored pantyhose and what that really looks like. I'm guessing most of you can remember the flesh-colored crayon in the Crayola crayon box that was nice and pink. When you walk in the restroom to put your hands under the faucet or the soap dispensers that you don't have to touch, those are based on light refraction and infrared. The darker your skin, the more it absorbs light. They had to be redesigned so that they work for darker skinned folks. And I'm not that dark, and I still have to go from sink to sink sometimes. So clearly no one was in the design phase of the process, nor the testing phase, who looked like me. Therefore, it worked for everybody in the room. Great product, let's put this out. So it has to be, there's a specific process you have to utilize when you install these in India and Pakistan and South Africa, right? So that they work for the folks that they're designed to work for. You know, it hasn't been that long since we've had Disney princesses of color. Idris Elba can be James Bond because James Bond can be a black man, even though it's a fictional character. We can talk about, you know, Colorado being one of 5 states that's passed what's called the Crown Act to protect against discrimination, the way that hair grows out of black folks, most specifically black women's head, when they want to wear their hair naturally. Because you have, court cases have said you cannot hire or fire someone wearing their hair naturally because you think it's unprofessional. There's no need for legislation for a blonde ponytail. So again, what is the default for what is professional? And so we can talk about artificial intelligence, we can talk about, you know, photography, we can talk about the classics and music and literature and where those come from. But again, white supremacy has nothing to do with violence. And so how are we taking into consideration everything outside that dominant culture paradigm of whiteness as the default, right? Somebody go down to the bottom of your screen and click on the reactions where you can put your hand up or, you know, applaud or whatever you can do with the reactions at the bottom of your screen, please. Somebody just put one up there. Do we have them? Can we access them? I don't know if they're there. I don't see mine. Maybe they aren't there yet. So if and when you can, a little yellow hand pops up. I raise my hand, it's a little yellow hand. And people of color have to figure out how to go into their settings and change them so they look like them, assuming they want to go through all the headache of doing that. Same with my phones, right? It might be just an innocuous, silly example, but it's one example of the things that folks of color go through on a daily basis that tells us we're not part of the norm and we have to do something to demonstrate we are still here and we want to be seen as us. And that's the real question. And that's the description and definition of white supremacy, which has nothing to do with violence. So as triggering as that statement is, that phrasing is, I understand that it is. I'll just pause and see if there's any thoughts, questions, pushback, disagreement. I'm a recovering attorney. I love a good debate. So happy to hear any thoughts on the idea. A lot to think about in a short period of time, I know. Okay, I'm talking fast because I have 17 minutes left to go if I leave you 30. So just again, something to think about. So what is it that we consider kind of the default without thinking? And that's really what this conversation is. How do we ensure that we're thinking about those who we're best trying to serve and not the default norm of what usually happens?
Dante, you can have a few extra minutes. I know sorry about that echo.
No.
Yeah, we started you late, so no worries.
All right, thanks. So I'm gonna go back to the screen and we will keep going. So impacts. What do impacts really look like? Exclusionary zoning, right? What is it? Just by itself, it's just simply laws that place restrictions on the types of homes and that can be built in a particular neighborhood, right? Common examples, which again sound innocuous. Well, this is a nice, big, beautiful neighborhood. We want a certain lot size, minimum square. We don't want any little bitty tiny houses, so there's a minimum square footage requirement. We don't want multi-family homes. We want to maintain the character of the neighborhood. All of those things. But what do they do, right? How do they discriminate? Large lot zoning does discriminate. All of these types of things. Citizen opposition and discretionary approvals create detrimental outcomes or disparate outcomes, right? What's the definition of a family, single family home? What's that definition? Who gets to make that definition, right? And how does that impact folks that don't fit within that definition? So an impact on just social welfare, because where a family lives matters. The outcomes on sometimes long-term effects of that family matters on where they live, right? Everything that leads up to, right? Lower test scores, for example, lower income because of job situations and what jobs are around in certain neighborhoods, right? All of these things can be a result of exclusionary zoning. And I saw some folks had talked about that. I think in your last meeting, you had talked about the tree canopy as an example of what impacts not having one can do, right? Heat islands, just the higher temperatures in some neighborhoods because the trees just don't exist. There's more concrete, there's more buildings, there's more parking lots, all of those things. So how, just the little things we don't think about as we're talking about a plan, we're talking about planning, those little things that maybe just don't get considered. And as a result, certainly just looking at single family detached homes and the requirements or the zoning requirements for that, what does that do sometimes? Well, it lowers the percentage of folks or residents who are Black or Latino as an outcome, right? Then you can hear from your neighbors, neighborhood community who comes out to speak, usually out against something as it relates to inclusionary zoning, just the varieties of things that you'll be talking about in your planning process. What's the coded language, right? You know, the people who live here now versus those who were here long before we were. Well, we want to maintain the character. What character are you talking about? The flavor, same thing. What is that flavor you're describing? Well, we don't want more crowding. We don't want more this. We don't want more that. We want to live in an upscale neighborhood as if, you know, people of color or multifamily homes mean it's not an upscale neighborhood anymore. Or, you know, this is why.
Sir, can I?
Yeah,
can I ask a question? Yeah. So I hear what you're saying regarding single family homes and single family zoning, because we've recently gone through this on the east side. But in the case of Jefferson Park, through the last Blueprint Denver, single family or single unit was largely obliterated, and multifamily and specifically duplex was allowed and encouraged, and that's what has happened, and slot homes. And yet it's also meant that our racial diversity has gone. And so I question what we're going to do beyond adding density to help keep people of color, the remaining people of color here in the neighborhood. Because as in the case of Jefferson Park, it has significantly densified, and yet also it's gone almost completely white.
That's a great question. And I'm guessing each person on this call has a whole different answer. And I'll just suggest one, this is an example of things to consider. I'm not offering this as, the Bible on what to take a look at, but also what are the amenities that still exist in the community to keep people there in the first place? When the bodegas disappear, when the laundry disappears, when the beauty shop, the hairdresser, barbershop disappears, the churches disappear, or that's the only thing left is the churches, and everybody has to come back into the neighborhood to go to the churches. What are those things that still remain for the people who were living there before? And so everything that is their community is pushed out in that forced displacement. What's left for them? You can't just walk down the street now and have the same conversation at the bodega that I used to have 5 years ago. And so it's not just the housing pattern, but it's also the amenities and the other things that go along with that. But I would ask,
I would like to go, Mr. James, I would like to like go ahead and comment on that. I live in Jefferson Park on 23rd and 23rd and Clay, right at the park. And the only reason why I'm able to live in this neighborhood is because my wife, before she ever met me, was blessed enough to get an affordable housing unit. You know what I mean? Like, so that's the only reason that we're there. And we're actually blessed enough that there is still a taqueria on 23rd and Federal, and then a small Chicano owned barbershop that's right there, so and then across the street there's a piñateria, there's that does flowers and has dulces, Mexican candy. So it's there's a wisp left barely right there on 23rd and Federal, you know what I mean, that you don't start seeing throughout the corridor until you start hitting that 6th and Federal area where it picks back up again. You know what I mean? So it's 23rd and Federal, and then you have a huge gap, and then 6th and Federal is where you start seeing nevarias and endoserias and things like that. So it's just 32nd and Federal was a thriving Little Mexico. You know what I mean? And the only thing left is really a restaurant and Panaderia Rosales. When I went to school there was Mexican tape shops and jewelry shops and boot shops and just to say that, 23rd and Federal literally is there's barely anything left that will give you a hint of what was, Yeah.
Right. Ben, and just to add to that, the good news at 23rd and Federal is that those businesses that you just described, the Taqueria Mi Pueblo, that business owner, they own their property. And across the street, Gilbert Vasquez owns the property that is the Piñateria La Fiesta. And so how can we keep those property owners engaged and interested in the neighborhood when the residential makeup has significantly changed? That's one of our highest priorities. Because really, as we mentioned in the earlier stakeholder group, the character of the businesses really contributes a lot to the character of a neighborhood. And in the case of the taqueria, that's still a fantastic and affordable meal for tons of people. So thank you for calling out those businesses specifically, because those businesses, if you go into any of them, the owners are behind the counter every day. March is at the Piñateria, Graciela is at the taqueria, and they own, and the Vasquez's and Jesus and Graciela Tarin own their properties. So we're hoping to keep that around. But also, we want a situation with this neighborhood plan where their employees or they can afford to live in their neighborhood. And the way Jefferson Park has gone over the last few years, that dream has disappeared. And Ben, you're right. You got in at just the right time. But for those who didn't, How do we welcome them into the neighborhood? How can we make sure that they have some foothold? Whereas right now I'm worried that they have none.
Completely agree with you. So
That's a great conversation.
Rant over.
Druki?
Yeah, so this is kind of an interesting conversation, and it goes back to that there isn't a single answer. There is multiple things that have to be done at the same time. So there are a lot of people who think density fixes affordability, but that could still lead to gentrification, right? So it's about making room for the people who still live there, or making room for all kinds of income levels. So simply building more luxury density still leads to gentrification. It's being able to have those affordable units. And then on the issue of the businesses, you know, those businesses that serve the folks who currently live there, if those folks are gone, those businesses will eventually leave because they won't be serving necessarily the people who are living there. So it's about making room. So it's not simply let's do density and that fixes everything. It's about making room for all of the other things that would allow for those dynamics to stay. So you know, this is a conversation that's had on Twitter and Facebook with, you know, different ideologies of people who think let's just build more and that's going to solve everything. It's not going to solve everything. We need other things such as inclusionary housing, such as mandating more affordability units, things like that. And also how, you know, also this is one that I think about with the gentrification, you know, how, you know, if I was someone who moved here and I bought my house for $50,000 and now somebody's offering me 500, you know, I may still take it. I may be, you know, adding to this issue of gentrification, but I may make a choice to take it. I don't know the answer to that, but it's about how to keep folks wanting to still live here, where, you know, to change the economics that they don't want to move. Because I don't know how to keep the culture here while the people leave.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Great point.
So up until we gentrified, when I moved in the neighborhood in the early 90s, we had distinct sections. We had the Italian neighborhood was still intact. There were restaurants and stores that the Italians still went to. Their church was there. There were areas that were Latino, and again, what part of what makes the neighborhood, as Ben said, is you've got the restaurants, you've got the shops, and often you've got your church. What's happened with density, the kind of density we have, say, in Lower Highland, is that we now have lots and lots and lots of people living in apartments and going out to many diverse, indistinguishable restaurants, rather than having these small communities where you talk to your neighbor in the little house next door that, by the way, their grandparents saved their pennies to build. We have people who are not going to church or going to Highland Church rather than going to Guadalupe or going to Mount Carmel. And we have put up big walls of apartment buildings that not only have really made everything else in the neighborhood unaffordable, but they've also made community very difficult, because it's a lot harder to visit with your neighbors when they're 5 stories up behind a big brick wall or a wooden wall or a metal wall or whatever they're putting up. And so there's a lot of nuances. And the thing about Lower Highland was it was a working class neighborhood. Upper Highland was an upper class neighborhood. It's mostly intact. And we're losing the community much more in the areas which all the working class moved into. So, you know, again, I think what you're presenting is valid, but in our 4 neighborhoods, we're working with some intangibles that go beyond race, ethnicity, but into the very idea of what our city should be, which is dense at the core, but community doesn't matter.
I just wanted to jump in. I'll let Dante keep going, but I think what we're trying to introduce here is kind of this lens, right? And that Dante gave us one example of something to think about. But as we talk about, what we're hearing from the community, and as we start to think about recommendations, always having that perspective of what impact does this have on communities and how are we furthering our equity goals. So just keeping that perspective throughout the process is what we're really trying to touch on tonight. And as Trupi said, these are very complex issues, and there's going to be complex recommendations and thoughts around this. So not presuming that we know the answer right now, but just trying to think about how do we keep this perspective as we continue through this process.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you. And thank you, Anita, for being here this evening. I'm going to share the screen once again, and we'll see if we can take it to the end here. I'm going to skip a couple of these, just in the interest of time. But again, what do we do? Because we can describe problems all day. But what do we begin to do? What are some things that we can do? In terms of our personal biases, there's lots of studies about how to deal with your own bias, become aware of them, et cetera. Just simply, here's what we say is, have the second thought, because you're going to have your first one. You're going to have your first thought based on whatever bias you have, stereotypes that are rolling around your head, all of those things. What's more important is to have the second thought that maybe asks you where that first dumbass thought came from. Is that based in anything in reality? Is it based in, my conversations with my crazy cousin 2 weeks ago? What is it based on? Because if you don't have the second thought, your first thought rules the day. This is how you begin to become an equitable anti-racist organization, not just a non-racist, but an anti as in doing something consciously, evaluating the everyday decisions and how they might be unbiased. And to do this work, you have to do it courageously and unapologetically, because you're going to get pushed back every day you do this work from folks who say it's not necessary, you're making more trouble, you're causing more division by talking about all these things. And so this is just raising that collective awareness that these issues exist and how to begin to address them. I'm going to skip some of this. Zoning we've talked about, right? Just some examples in zoning, right? How are the rules there? Again, examples. How do we place opportunities to build starter homes, ensure that there's an accommodation of housing developments, different types of housing developments, affordable housing, other types, and what does that mean? Can other folks besides developers build rental housing? What are the developers required to do in serving the housing needs of a particular community that they want to come into? Community engagement, they got you here, so there was community engagement, and understanding there's a difference between engagement and outreach, because outreach tends to be a one-way street, whereas engagement is a relationship. And is that authentic, right? Is there engagement in the budgeting? What's the budgeting process for doing all this work? You want to know what's important to any entity, follow the money, right? And if a budget is often described as a moral document, who are we taking care of and what's important within that document? This is the strategic planning process. And building capacity. I'm guessing all of you, each of you get called to do these meetings over and over and over. And so you're probably going to jump off this call like needed and go to your next meeting. So how is community capacity being built? How are you reaching out to folks who don't typically come in here, but are certainly willing and able to have these conversations around policy and other things? How are you helping to build capacity instead of just drain the folks over and over who are always here? Outcomes, these outcomes in different aspects where the service is being provided in different areas of the city or your neighborhoods, things like that. Like I said, I'm going fast. We have to be operating with urgency and accountability because people are being harmed or being left out or being marginalized all the time. This is using a racial equity framework, some type of framework to ask these questions. Be data driven. Do you know the data besides just the demographics? But do you know the data on dollars that are being spent in certain areas? Is there investment? What has been the disinvestment historically in your neighborhoods? Asking those types of questions to see, talking about reparations, what has been the disinvestment in the neighborhood that you're trying to address? What does success look like? There's all kinds of ways to measure success. Changes certainly in policies, practices, an equity plan, which is this on some level, how do we infuse equity in this planning process? And then the changes in outcomes, right? Are there changes in where the investments may be happening? What some of those policies are, what some of the zoning changes may be? What are some of those successful outcomes for doing this work? And then an equity lens, which is the buzzword of the day. But if it's just a critical thinking exercise, but if you don't know what questions to ask, you often get stuck knowing where to start. So we just provide 4 basic questions to start to apply to any policy, any process, any practice. First, similar to have the second thought, what are some of the assumptions underlying this policy, this zoning policy, this approach? Why do we think this is the way to do this? Or why do we think we shouldn't do it this way because? What are those assumptions? Specifically, how might this policy, for example, burden communities of color? What unintended consequences may be existing? And then how do we involve the most impacted? You are here to represent different aspects of your neighborhood, of your communities. How are we hearing from those who are going to be most impacted in this decision-making process? And then finally, what are some strategies to reduce or eliminate all the things that maybe we've begun to identify? There's no data question in here, but you can't address most of these without knowing some of the data. These basic 4 questions should lead you to a whole lot more questions. And you can apply these 4 questions to anything, any policy, to any new policy, to any program, any reevaluation or recreation of a policy, a program, a practice, just beginning to ask these basic questions. And then also, what is the historical perspective in terms of the evaluation of whatever it is that you're taking a look at? Is there a historical perspective? Has there been, for example, disinvestment? Has there been zoning that has been creating disparate outcomes in certain areas of the community in the Northwest? So beginning to ask those questions as a foundational component to where do we need to go and what do we need to do and how should we need to do it? So this is the equity lens that we offer to folks all over the place. The planning has this, they went through their process with some of these questions as well. And we would encourage you to do the same. I know, I'm not sure if Liz sent out the PowerPoint yet, but you'll get these questions specifically. And there's no allegation in any of the questions. Just because we ask, how might this detrimentally impact people of color, doesn't mean anybody's accusing anyone of being a racist. We just need to know how well we're doing. What's the baseline? Because if we don't know where we are, we certainly don't know where we might need to go. We can do the same thing with disability. We can do the same thing with gender, any identity, just how are we doing? Do we know how well we're doing? It's not an accusation of anything. It's just a question of what's our baseline and do we know it and are we satisfied with it? So that in about 90 minutes is my content for the evening. There's a lot of stuff packed in there. But hopefully it's provided just some different ways to think about something and or look at something, or maybe some different questions that come to mind as you're going to walk through this process. And so I certainly wish you much success as you do this, and much perseverance as you do this, because it takes perfect perseverance to do this work. So I truly thank you for your time and your engagement with me this evening, and thank you for planning, and Liz for really making this a part of the conversation.
Thank you, Dante. I don't know why I'm getting that echo, but yeah, I hope everybody appreciated just that. I know it was quick, but we thought it was important to provide that background. If anybody wants to share any thoughts about how they're feeling, we can certainly save some time for that. I think you all also saw the draft community engagement strategy that we sent out earlier last week, and we really want to devote time at our August meeting. And I hope this gives you some perspective for how we're putting that together, and making equity be a key goal on how we engage with the community and where we put our engagement resources. So we'll certainly have time at our next meeting as well. But if there's anything anybody wanted to share now, we'll leave a few minutes at the end to go over some of our upcoming events. But please feel free.
So one thing is I want to apologize to everybody because I don't want to take space. There's so many people that are here right now that need to speak and share when they feel comfortable to do so. But I appreciate Mr. James in setting this foreground. And I don't know if you're just here just for this evening, or if you'll be continually helping us maintain that compass, doing temperature checks throughout this process. But if it's just this evening, I would definitely encourage all of the planners and everyone else to advocate that Mr. James comes back periodically for temperature checks and to help us maintain that, that bearing. And I'll leave that be my last comment for the evening.
Thank you, Ben. For right now, Dante's just with us for this evening, but I appreciate that suggestion because we certainly do want to make sure we're kind of bringing this up to, and Dante left us with some questions, but we want to make sure we're thinking about that again as we go through, the steps of this process, making sure that it continues to be at the forefront. So appreciate that suggestion.
Well, thank you, everyone. I will leave you with the rest of your evening and again, wish you much success because it's just so important. I look forward to seeing the outcome of your work very soon. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And we are recording this and I'll be sure to send out the slides as well. So if you want to refer back or look at those in more detail, you're welcome to do that as well. And I know we keep packing in a lot to the evening, so we'll definitely try to plan to make sure we have more breaks as we go forward and more time for us to chat. So I just want to bring up a couple more slides. I can share back again. Let's see. Okay. Are you all seeing my slides or no? Yes? Okay.
Yes.
Sorry. Okay. To display. And it went back to that weird setting. There we go. Okay. So kind of with that mindset of what we just talked through, I think we're just getting started in this process and really trying to get the word out and also engage with communities that we don't typically hear from. And we're really looking to you all to help us with that engagement and making sure that we're reaching those groups. So that from a general perspective, we have kind of a series of events, and we talked about this last time we don't really see it as like one big public meeting that we want to try to get everybody to, but that we want to, over the next few months, try to engage with as many people as possible and making sure, again, that we're getting to those groups that we might not typically hear from. So the first big one is that we have a virtual meeting happening next week. Invite all of you to attend on that meeting. It'll be kind of a mix of providing the overview of the process and then also giving opportunity for some interaction with the community. We also have put up an online survey that we would appreciate you all sending out to your networks. I will send the email again to all of you after this, just in case you're not getting the updates and you're not signed up on our website for updates. I'll send those to you as well again. And then we're focusing on kind of attending as many events as we can that are happening in the community. So we're looking to you. So if you know of things that are already going on in the community, we'd love to kind of join you at those events and share about the plan and gather input. And then we're working on kind of strategizing on how we reach out to some of those focus groups and the groups that we don't typically hear from. So up on the website, you'll find information about the community kickoff, the survey itself. I will also send to you flyers that we've made about ways to engage with the plan. There is, the opportunity at these in-person events to do a survey in person. It doesn't have to be online. And we do have a phone number, and we'd be happy to talk to people that way as well. But we would love for everyone on this call to help us with spreading the word. And if you have ideas about groups that we can meet with, appreciate those connection points. And we're really open to kind of doing that engagement in any way that works for the group or for the event. So if it's, you know, something that's happening in the park, we can set up a table. We can come with a map and talk to people at a particular meeting. We're also open to doing very quick surveys, and really any way that works for the event. And we've started, and I will share with this group, you know, a spreadsheet of things that we already know that are happening. I think Trupti gets a gold star for sending me a lot of suggestions for things that are already happening in Sunnyside, but we really would like for you all to help with filling this out. And then also will be, again, those ideas about how we reach the people. Trupti was great and got us, we're gonna be at Quig Newton this Thursday to talk to, you know, at the DHA property to talk to folks there. But if you have suggestions for how we connect with some of those groups, or you have those connections, we appreciate you sending those our way. So I don't know if anybody wants to touch base on any of the events in the meantime, but I'll follow that up with an email after this. And then I wanted to also touch base on our just recurring schedule. But any thoughts on any events or groups that we should be reaching out to?
Yeah, Ben Chavez said La Raza Park Day is August 29th. And he's on the planning committee, and that will be Barnum to La Raza Park. So it will be, we could have a little table on August 29th.
Awesome. Thank you, Councilwoman.
And then my office is going to build out an actual calendar that you all can link to, and it will look like a calendar that has the events on there, because for this, it's hard for me to work off an Excel spreadsheet. I condition myself to look off a calendar. So we have Manny in my office is working on that and should be up and running soon. I guess they're super easy to make.
Yeah, we appreciate that partnership, Councilwoman Sandoval. I think that the spreadsheet's helpful for us to just see what, you know, what event you may have and the type of event it is, so that we can plan for what we should bring along with us in that piece. And then the idea is to then populate this calendar so then everybody can know what's happening in the neighborhood. Right now, you'll see that little sidebar on the side. That's what we have up on the website right now for the events that are confirmed. So if anybody comes to the website, they can see where they can meet us in person. But thank you, Councilwoman, for offering to create the calendar. Any other ideas?
Liz, can I just say something real quick?
Yeah, sure.
Just for the steering committee members, we do have several flyers. We've printed them out. So if anyone is interested in having some flyers that you could send out either at classrooms or at work or any other locations that you think, we can deliver those to you. Just let us know.
Yes, and Edson did do some flyering this weekend as well. So if you have locations that you would suggest to us that you think that there will be a lot of people at, that would be a great place to have a poster up about the plan, you can send us those as well.
And we have talked about, Nola mentioned back to school nights in the chat. I'm working on getting a list of all the back to school nights. That's on my list of things to do so that we can populate the calendar. But yeah, Nola, I agree. We should piggyback on the back to school night.
Thank you. I can't see the chat at the moment, so I apologize. I'm not catching some of that.
And we will go through the chat too. So if there's anything that you guys have put in there that we haven't highlighted, we'll check through that all and follow up with questions if we have them with an email.
And we're also working on compiling contacts at apartment buildings and at some of the churches and other religious institutions. But if any of you have contacts at any of those institutions, we appreciate that connection point too as well. Might have more success for setting up some engagement there.
Liz, have they done the dedication of the new city housing building down at on lower 32nd?
That was actually mentioned at the RNO meeting as well. I haven't quite looked into that one yet, but I think that's a good suggestion. You're talking about the DHA
Yeah.
property, yeah. And we do have Renee, who wasn't able to make it tonight, but she works for DHA, and she's a good connection point for us there as well. Okay, well, we'll move on to the next piece because I don't want to take up too much time, but I challenge each of you to kind of think of one event or one connection point that you have in the community that would be great for us to engage with now as we're getting started, and send that our way. And I'll send this spreadsheet as well that you can add ideas into. I think we will also be thinking about ways to do tours or see each other in person as we get to our next one. And it would be great maybe to get people together around the neighborhoods that they live in or work in, and think about how we offer up some of those in-person, get out in the neighborhood opportunities. So we'll be touching base with you about that as well. So, okay. What quick time check? We got 10 minutes left. So I think I'm really happy that we have such a great group and a big group of people, but of course that has led us to the difficulty of trying to find like a date that works for everybody. And just so you're thinking through, like, why do we need to find a regular one? I think it just gives us some predictability throughout the process, and for the public who might want to listen in on a meeting or stop by at a meeting to know, like, oh, it always happens on this day of the month. So that's why we try to get that established, so then you can just have it on your calendar for the rest of the process. And there still might be times that we decide we don't need to particularly meet on a certain month if it's not needed. But these were the two, and I thought maybe we could do like a quick, if everybody could do in the chat, of what if the two top ones of the process of the survey, for those who filled it out, were the third Thursday of the month. So the next meeting would be August 19th, and the fourth Tuesday. I will say that the fourth week can be challenging sometimes because of holidays, particularly that happen in November and December. So we might need to find a different date on those ones. But if everybody, and maybe this is too quick on the top of your mind, but if you could think through whether if you have a preference between those two, or if you could do two, you could just put in the chat 1, 2, or 1 or 2. Maybe we could land in this meeting on a decision there. And I will say that there was generally a preference for alternating or keeping some virtual component to our meetings. So I asked in the survey about whether folks wanted to stay virtual, they wanted to go to in-person, or have kind of a mix. So we got that feedback on still it's good to have some virtual opportunities. So we'll probably stick with that idea of maybe the next meeting will be virtual, and then we'll look for locations near Northwest where we can do some in-person events and in-person meetings. Because I think it'd be helpful for us all to get into the same room, but that we'll still keep this virtual component every other month, or we'll try to do the in-person every couple of months, if that makes sense for most people. And I'm gonna close this presentation. I don't know if Ella or Edson can see anything in the chat in terms of some of the
I can, and we have I haven't counted them, but we don't have a clear winner. I know there are some people who are saying 1 please, and some are saying 2 please, and then some of both.
Does anyone feel strongly like they absolutely could not make one work? And it's okay if you miss a meeting here or there. So don't feel like you have to be at every single meeting, particularly the virtual ones we will record, but we'll also send out materials and summaries for the in-person as well. So does anybody raise your hand like you just absolutely couldn't do one of those?
Every fourth Thursday in Honey would conflict with our Honey Hours, which is a really great place and time to interact with folks. So I'd have to choose which I was going to go to.
So it's the It's the third Thursday and the fourth Tuesday. It's fourth Tuesday,
Oh,
is
fourth
what you're
Tuesday.
saying?
Oh, okay. No, that'll work. That'll work.
Okay, okay. Sorry, I'm just scrolling through these. I know it's, so most people could do both, but you just have a preference for one. Am I reading that right? So if we went with third Thursday, would that be okay? Only reason I'm leaning towards that is so that we don't have to reschedule potentially in November or December. Would that? I see Charlie liked 2 better, but is that okay? Can we go with the third Thursday? Okay,
Works for me.
let's go for that one. So I can not send you endless doodle polls. So we'll go with third Thursday. Appreciate everybody kind of working towards that. And again, if you need to miss one, it's not a problem, and we'll work with you on making sure you're up to speed.
Will you be sending us a recurring invite?
Yep. I'll send you a recurring invite, and this way we can also make the Zoom invite recurring as well. So you kind of have that standard link that you can use as well. So I'll do both of those. And then I'll send the presentation from today and this spreadsheet, if you can help us fill out and think about some of the events. And I'll also remind you if you can review that community engagement strategy ahead of our next meeting, so that can be kind of our primary discussion. And I apologize if you hear my 7-month-old who's decided to start screaming in the background.
7 months already.
7 months already. I know, it goes by quickly.
I'd like to invite everybody to our barbecue at Factotum. Liz is actually going to have 30 minutes, and we're hoping to do a Q&A if she's got time. It'd be great if, especially, all of you guys are invited, but especially if the Sunnyside folks come, because it's our annual meeting. So be a good chance for you guys to hear what folks are saying or asking about. It'd be great. Thank you.
What was the date of that again, Tripti?
It is Thursday, 7/29. It's at Factotum. It's it's a barbecue, and you have to register on Factotum's website. But if you look at our Facebook, any of our social media, you'll find how to register for that.
And we do have it on the plan website as well. So on the right side of the Near Northwest plan, you'll see the link to it.
We also actually brewed a beer for it, especially for it. So it'll be fun.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. So with that, I gave you used a lot of brain power today with the training. So appreciate all your time, and stay tuned for some emails, and hope to see you all in person soon.
Thanks for making that happen.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thanks, Liz.